Last week, I published a video that surprised a lot of people. In that video, I apologized. I explained that I grew up as a conservative Republican and that I had profoundly underestimated the degree to which racism, bigotry, and discrimination remained active forces in American life. I said that I was wrong, and I said I was sorry, and I meant it. The response to that video has been overwhelmingly positive, but I've also received a number of comments asking a very fair question. How could you not have seen it? How could you not have known? How could you have missed something that now seems so obvious? Those are important questions, and I'd like to at least try to answer them. Now, let me be very clear here. Nothing I'm about to say is intended to excuse my ignorance. Ignorance may explain a mistake, but it doesn't justify it. And that's not my intent here. What I want to do instead is examine the thought process that led me there, because I think that there are lessons to be gleaned from that experience. I mean, not for nothing, you need to understand where I grew up. I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania, Dutch country. When people hear that I grew up conservative, many people immediately imagine sort of the modern national conservative movement. But that's not the brand of conservatism that I grew up with. I grew up around the Mennonites, the Amish communities, and other deeply religious Protestant traditions. Now, those communities are unquestionably socially conservative. You can see it in the way they dress. Those communities are also heavily influenced by a belief in the inherent dignity of every human being. And those doctrines run deep. I grew up about 30 minutes from the former law office of Thaddeus Stevens, one of the leaders of the radical Republican movement during the American Civil War. Thaddeus Stevens and his colleagues from that part of the country were deeply rooted in abolitionism and anti-slavery activism. The conservatism that I inherited flowed from that tradition. The people I grew up with, while undeniably conservative, also believed that every person was created in the image of God and therefore possessed intrinsic worth and dignity. I mean, we disagreed about many things, and we continue to disagree about many things. But outright cruelty towards an entire group of people was not something that I encountered regularly. And that environment actually contributed to my mistakes. I assumed that that brand of conservatism was representative of conservatism writ large. I assumed that because the people I knew were generally decent, the darker forces of American conservatism had largely been pushed to the margins. I assumed that because I rarely encountered open bigotry in my daily life, open bigotry must have become rare. And that was my first mistake. My second mistake is one that has been pointed out to me by a bunch of other commentators. And they're right. I was confusing legal progress with cultural progress, and they're not the same. I looked at the Civil Rights Act. I looked at the Voting Rights Act. I looked at the growing acceptance of interracial marriage. I looked at the growing acceptance of LGBTQ Americans, and I assumed that those victories were secure. I mistakenly assumed that once a society formally rejected those types of ideas, that the ideas had largely been defeated in society generally. History should have taught me otherwise. Bad ideas rarely disappear overnight. They usually wait years, decades, even generations. And I should have known that. But as I've reflected on these things over the last several years, I've come to believe that the political philosopher Charles W. Mills may have identified a key part of the problem. Mills wrote about something called white ignorance. Now, before anybody gets defensive, Mills was not arguing that white people are stupid. Far from it. Nor was he arguing that white people were evil. And he certainly wasn't arguing that every white person consciously supports racism. His observations were far more subtle. He argued, and I think correctly, that people who occupy privileged positions in society can become insulated from certain kinds of knowledge. And I was privileged. And I probably was insulated from certain kinds of knowledge. Now, it's not because they're bad people, and it's not because they're incapable of learning. It's because they simply do not encounter certain realities in their everyday lives. And the uncomfortable truth is, that's me, or at least was me as a young adult. I grew up in a safe community. I had access to good schools. I had opportunities. I grew up surrounded by people who generally tried to treat one another decently. And because I was surrounded by decent people, I assumed the country was mostly made up of people like the people that I knew. I mistook my own experience for reality. And again, those aren't the same thing. As I've reflected on Mill's work, I've been reminded of something I encountered during my time working in the intelligence community. I mean, there's a concept in intelligence analysis called mirror imaging, and it's something to be avoided. Mirror imaging occurs when an analyst tries to understand another person, another country, or another organization by unconsciously assuming that they think the same way that the analyst thinks. Now, the analyst is trying to put himself in that other person's shoes, but in the process, the analyst is making a false assumption that the other person looks at the world through the same lenses that the analyst does. The analyst assumes that the other person shares their values. The analyst assumes that the other person shares their priorities. Again, the analyst assumes that the other person sees the world the same way that he or she does. And there's danger in this because when an analyst engages in mirror imaging, they can completely misunderstand what is actually happening. The intelligence community recognizes mirror imaging as a serious analytical failure, and it is. The more I've thought about it, the more I think Charles Mills was describing a social version of the same phenomenon. I looked at America through the lens of my own experience. I wasn't putting myself into other people's shoes. I was inadvertently putting them into mine. And that was my mistake. But I think it's a mistake that people across the political spectrum are making every day. We assume our experience is normal. We assume our perspective is objective. We assume that our reality is everyone else's reality. But sometimes what we're actually seeing is ourselves reflected back at us. So at this point, some people may reasonably ask, okay, Nate, if you had these blind spots, how did you begin to overcome them? How did you go from being a young conservative who grossly underestimated the impact of racism and bigotry in American society to someone who at least has a better appreciation for the experiences of Black Americans, LGBTQ plus Americans, Muslim Americans, women, and other communities whose experience differ radically from my own? And the truth is, I'm still learning. I am nowhere near full understanding. You are not going to see Nate Charles sitting on a mountaintop somewhere having achieved the nirvana of universal understanding anytime soon. And acknowledging that is a very important part of my journey. But I can tell you what I think has helped. First, education. And I don't simply mean accumulating credentials. I mean placing yourself in environments where you encounter people whose lives are different from your own. One of the things that I have come to appreciate over the years is that diversity is not merely a moral good. It is an epistemological good. It helps us learn. It helps us identify our blind spots. It reminds us that our experiences are not universal. Now, I think the second thing, and maybe even more important, was travel. And I don't mean sitting on a beach drinking cocktails. During my time as a Navy SEAL, much of my work involved serving as an advisor of foreign military forces. Over the course of my career, I worked with dozens of military organizations throughout the Middle East. And in the process, I became friends with many Muslims. Not abstractions, not stereotypes, not political talking points. People with families, people with hopes and fears, people who love their children, people who worry about their future, people who wanted dignity and opportunity. In other words, people. That experience changed me. The third thing I think that changed me was war itself. One of the most surprising lessons that I learned from my time in Afghanistan came from visiting villages that Americans often understood almost exclusively through the lens of terrorism, insurgency, and geopolitics. But when you actually talk to people in those villages, you discover something that is equal parts remarkable and mundane. Their concerns generally aren't about terrorism. They're about other things that are incredibly ordinary. Healthcare, education, jobs, economic opportunity, whether their children will have a better life than they did. I remember distinctly going to one village where we came in, we raided the whole village, and we said, hey, we know that some members of the Taliban were here recently. And one of the village elders told us straight out, yeah, they were here a few days ago. You just missed them. We think they went that way. But that's not really the problem I'm trying to deal with right now. My problem is I've got 4 people holed up in a shack on the outskirts of the village who are all infected with tuberculosis because we don't have broad spectrum antibiotics. And it just so happened my corpsman did have broad spectrum antibiotics. So we fixed that problem. And guess what? That village remained relatively friendly. In other words, many of their concerns were exactly the same concerns that exist in communities all across America. And the more of them that I met, the harder it became to reduce them to categories. The more experiences I had, the harder it became to believe that my own perspective was universal. But if I'm being completely honest, one of the most formative experiences of my life didn't happen overseas. It happened after I became a lawyer. When I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., one of my first assignments was in a street-level prosecution unit handling domestic violence cases. And for the first time in my life, I found myself working closely with crime victims every single day. Not in the abstract, not as statistics, not as political talking points. Real people, real families, real suffering. And the overwhelming majority of those victims were women. And even more importantly, most of them were Black women. Now, looking back, I realized how sheltered I had been. I had grown up in a stable home. I had access to educational opportunities. I had never personally experienced many of the hardships that these women faced. And I suddenly found myself sitting across from people whose life experiences were profoundly different than my own. Women who were merely trying to protect themselves and their children. Women who are navigating poverty, violence, housing insecurity, and systemic obstacles that I had never personally encountered. Women who had every reason to distrust institutions, but nevertheless kept moving forward because they had no choice. And the thing that struck me was not how different they were from me, it's how similar they were. They loved their kids. They worried about their futures. They wanted safety. They wanted opportunity. They wanted dignity. The same things that every human wants. But unlike me, many of them were carrying burdens that I had never understood and certainly never had to carry. And once you spend enough time listening to people tell you about experiences that you yourself have never lived through, something starts to happen. You become less certain. You become less confident that your own experience is representative. You become less willing to assume that because something is invisible to you, it must not exist. One of the more interesting responses to my last video came from people who told me that they did not accept my apology because they believed it was impossible that I could have missed what was happening. And to be clear, no one owes me forgiveness. But the more I reflect on those comments, the more I think they actually reinforce the point that Charles Mills was trying to make. Because the entire thesis of white ignorance is that human beings often struggle to see beyond the limits of their own experience. My mistake was assuming that my experience of America was representative of America as a whole. But if somebody looks at my experience and concludes that it was impossible simply because it differs from their own experience, they're falling into a similar trap. Not the same trap, but a related one. They're assuming that their experience is universal. And the truth is, and the most important part of this talk is, that none of us possess a complete picture. None of us. Everyone has blind spots. Every one of us has things we don't know because we've never had to know them. The lesson I've taken from all of this is not that I was uniquely foolish. The lesson is that human beings are remarkably good at mistaking their perspective for reality. I did it. Other people do it. And if we're honest with ourselves, we're probably doing it right now in ways we haven't even discovered yet. Which brings me back to Charles Mills. The value of his work is not that it tells us who is right and who is wrong. The value of his work is that it reminds us of the limits of our own perspective. It reminds us that understanding begins with humility. It reminds us that if we genuinely want to understand other people, we must be willing to leave the boundaries of our own experience. We must be willing to listen. We must be willing to learn. And we must be willing to travel, to read, to study, and to meet people who are different from us. And even more fundamentally, we have to be willing to ask a simple question. What might I be missing? That question changed my life. It changed my politics. And it certainly changed the way that I understand my own country. And frankly, I think America will be a healthier place when more of us are willing to ask it.